A struggling young woman, humiliated after asking for leftovers at a high-profile charity dinner. The host laughed in her face until he saw her name on a life-changing patent. What happened next will restore your faith in resilience and second chances. Stay tuned for an emotional journey of grit, redemption, and unexpected connections. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story like this. The Last Resort. The grand ballroom of the Chicago Metropolitan Tower shimmered under crystal chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and seared filet mignon. Waiters in crisp tuxedos glided between tables, pouring champagne into flutes for the city's elite. Tech moguls, venture capitalists, and philanthropists who had gathered for the annual Kingsley Foundation Charity Gala. The cause? Clean water initiatives in developing nations. The irony? Lila Carter hadn't tasted clean water or a decent meal in days. She stood near the kitchen entrance, her stomach growling loud enough to rival the string quartet in the corner. Her fingers clutched the edges of her thrift store blazer, the only thing that made her look even remotely like she belonged. The truth? She hadn't been invited. She hadn't even been able to afford the $5,000 plate fee. But hunger had a way of making people bold. Lila had spent the last 6 months surviving on instant ramen and coffee shop Wi-Fi, pouring every waking hour into her passion project, a portable, low-cost water filtration system that could change lives in places like Flint or rural Kenya. But rejection emails piled up faster than her unpaid bills. Investors called her design quaint. One even laughed and said, if this was viable, someone smarter would have already patented it. Now, here she was, stomach hollow, pride even emptier, watching half-eaten plates of truffle risotto and lobster tail get whisked away to the trash. The waste made her physically ache. She waited until the dessert course was cleared, then slipped toward the back of the room where the catering staff stacked trays. A young busboy shot her a suspicious glance. You knew? He muttered. Lila forced a smile. Just helping out. Her hands trembled as she grabbed a discarded bread roll, shoving it into her pocket. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she marched straight toward the head table, where Daniel Kingsley, the 40-year-old billionaire founder of Aquasphere Technologies, held court. He was mid-laugh, his sharp jawline tilted back as a senator clapped him on the shoulder. Up close, he looked even more intimidating. Charcoal suit tailored perfection, Rolex glinting under the lights. The kind of man who'd never had to choose between rent and groceries. Lila's throat tightened, but she cleared it. Excuse me, Mr. Kingsley. The chatter at the table died. Daniel turned, his dark eyebrows lifting as he took in her scuff flats, the way her blazer strained at the seams. Can I help you? His voice was smooth, amused, like she was a curiosity. Lila swallowed. I was wondering if it wouldn't be too much trouble. Could I take some of the leftover food? For a friend. A beat of silence. Then Daniel's lips twitched. Volunteers aren't supposed to take donations, he said, as if explaining something to a child. A few guests tittered. Heat flooded Lila's cheeks. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and held it out. Here, buy yourself a proper meal. The condescension in his voice was like a slap. Lila's fingers curled into fists, but she forced them open. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Keep it, she whispered. She turned on her heel, but in her haste, her worn-out satchel slipped from her shoulder. The contents spilled across the marble floor. Lip balm, a granola bar wrapper, and her battered notebook. Its pages splayed open to a series of intricate sketches. Wait, Daniel called after her. But Lila was already pushing through the crowd, humiliation burning like acid in her chest. She didn't look back. Behind her, Daniel knelt, picking up the notebook. His thumb brushed over a detailed schematic labeled in bold letters. Carter Filtration System. Patent pending. His smirk faded. Because of the design in front of him, it was the exact solution his R&D team had spent 2 years and millions of dollars failing to crack. And it belonged to the woman he'd just dismissed as a beggar. The patent that changed everything. The cold Chicago wind cut through Lila's thin jacket as she stumbled out of the hotel, her vision blurred with unshed tears. She didn't stop walking until she reached the dimly lit subway station, where she finally let out a shuddering breath. The $20 bill Daniel had offered still lay crumpled on the floor of the ballroom. She hadn't taken it. Pride was all she had left. Her stomach growled again, louder this time, and she pressed a hand against it as if she could silence the hunger through sheer will. The bread roll in her pocket felt like a cruel joke. She pulled it out, staring at the perfectly golden crust, now slightly squashed. A single bite would be heaven, but instead, she wrapped it back up. Tomorrow's breakfast, she told herself. The train ride back to her apartment was a blur. Her mind replayed the moment over and over. Daniel's smirk, the way his friend had chuckled, the way he'd looked at her like she was nothing. She squeezed her eyes shut. Never again. She wouldn't let herself be that desperate. Not for food. Not for validation. Not for anything. When she finally pushed open the door to her tiny studio apartment, the sight of her workbench, cluttered with prototypes, scribbled notes, and half-empty coffee cups, should have comforted her. But tonight, it just reminded her of every failure. She kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto her futon, not even bothering to turn on the lights. Meanwhile, back at the gala, Daniel Kingsley stood frozen in the middle of the emptying ballroom, Lila's notebook still in his hands. Sir, Mira Patel, his sharp-eyed assistant, approached cautiously. The car's ready. The board expects you at the after-party in 20. Daniel didn't answer. His thumb traced the edge of the notebook's open page, where Lila's sketches detailed a filtration system unlike anything his engineers had ever proposed. It was elegant, simple, brilliant. Who was that woman? He asked, his voice low. Mira hesitated. I don't know. She wasn't on the guest list. Security said she slipped in with the catering staff. Daniel snapped the notebook shut. Find her. Sir. Now. Mira blinked but didn't argue. She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. If she left anything behind, a name, a contact, we'll track her down. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He should have been at the after-party, schmoozing investors, securing the next round of funding for Aquasphere's expansion. But all he could think about was the look on Lila's face when he'd offered her that 20, the way she'd refused it. Who turns down money when they're clearly starving? Someone with pride, someone with something to prove, someone like him. 10 years ago, when he'd been the one begging for a chance. Lila woke to the sound of pounding. At first, she thought it was the pipes. Her apartment building was old enough that the plumbing groaned like a living thing. But then it came again. Harder. More urgent. Knock. 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 She sat up, heart racing. No one ever came to her door. No one even knew where she lived except her landlord, and he only showed up when rent was late. She crept forward, peering through the peephole, and nearly choked. Daniel Kingsley stood on the other side, his expensive coat dusted with snow, Lila's notebook clutched in his hand. No. No, no, no. Had he come to sue her? To accuse her of stealing his ideas? She'd been careful. She'd checked every patent database to make sure her design was original. But Aquasphere had lawyers. They could bury her in litigation until she had nothing left. The knocking came again. Lila Carter. Daniel called through the door. I know you're in there. Her breath came fast. She could pretend she wasn't home. But her lights were on. Her shoes were by the door. She had no choice. With shaking hands, she undid the latch and opened the door just enough to see his face. What do you want? She demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. Daniel held up her notebook. You invented this. It wasn't a question. Lila's throat tightened. Yes. How? She blinked. What? How did you solve the backflow issue? His voice was intense, almost hungry. My engineers have been stuck on it for months. Lila stared at him. This wasn't what she'd expected. No threats, no lawyers, just curiosity. Slowly, she opened the door wider. You came here to ask me about my design? Daniel's gaze flickered past her, taking in the cramped apartment, the workbench covered in prototypes. His expression shifted, something like realization, or maybe regret. I came, he said quietly, because I think we need to talk. And for the first time in years, Lila let herself hope. The betrayal. Lila's fingers tightened around the edge of the door, her knuckles turning white. The cold Chicago air seeped into her apartment, but she barely felt it. All she could focus on was Daniel Kingsley standing in her dimly lit hallway, holding her notebook like it was some kind of peace offering. "Talk?" she repeated, her voice edged with skepticism. "About what?" "How you could buy my patent for pennies and slap your company's name on it." Daniel exhaled sharply, his breath forming a small cloud in the cold air. "That's not why I'm here." "Then why?" For a moment, he didn't answer. His gaze flickered past her again, taking the makeshift workbench, the stacks of notebooks, the half-assembled prototype gathering dust in the corner. His jaw tightened. "Because it's a damn good design," he admitted, "and I want to know how you did it." Lila studied his face, searching for any hint of deception. But for the first time since she'd met him, Daniel Kingsley didn't look like a billionaire used to getting his way. He looked frustrated, almost desperate. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside. 5 minutes, she said. Daniel nodded and crossed the threshold, his polished shoes a stark contrast against her worn-out floorboards. He set the notebook down on her cluttered table, flipping it open to the page with her filtration schematic. "This part here," he said, pointing to a series of calculations in the margin. "How did you account for sediment buildup without slowing the flow rate?" My team kept hitting a wall with that. Lila hesitated. This was her work, her lifeline. Sharing it felt like handing over the last thing she had left. But the hunger for recognition, for someone to finally see what she'd accomplished, was stronger than her caution. She grabbed a pencil from the table and sketched a quick modification to the design. "You're thinking about the filter all wrong," she said. "It's not about trapping particles. It's about redirecting them. Like this." Daniel's eyes locked onto the page, his brow furrowing as he processed the solution. Then, slowly, he let out a low whistle. "That's actually genius." A flicker of pride warmed Lila's chest, but she quickly stamped it down. "Yeah, well, genius doesn't pay the rent." Daniel straightened, his expression turning serious. "It could." Lila crossed her arms. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I want to fund your project." She barked out a laugh. "Right. And what's the catch?" "No catch. Aquasphere invests in promising water tech all the time. Yours is more than promising. It's revolutionary." Lila's pulse quickened. This was what she'd wanted, what she'd dreamed of. But something in his tone, the way he said Aquasphere and not you, set off warning bells. "Let me guess," she said slowly. "You fund it, your company owns it, and I get a nice little footnote in the patent?" Daniel's silence was all the answer she needed. "Yeah, that's what I thought." She grabbed her notebook and shoved it into her bag. "Thanks, but no thanks. I didn't build this just to hand it over to some corporate machine." Daniel's patience snapped. "Then what's your plan, Lila? Keep tinkering in this apartment until you starve? This system could save lives, but not if it never leaves your workbench." The truth of his words stung. She had no plan, no money, no leverage. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed. A notification flashed on the screen, an email from the U.S. Patent Office. Her breath caught. Application status. Approved. She looked up, her eyes locking onto Daniel's. "I don't need your money," she said, her voice steady now. "I just got my patent." For a split second, Daniel looked genuinely stunned. Then, just as quickly, his expression shuddered. "Congratulations," he said coolly. "But patents aren't cheap to defend. And Aquasphere has deeper pockets than you." The threat hung in the air between them. Lila's stomach twisted. She'd known the game was rigged, but hearing out loud, feeling the weight of his influence, made her blood run cold. Daniel turned toward the door, then paused. "Think about my offer. You got 48 hours before I take it off the table." Then he was gone, leaving Lila standing alone in the silence, her victory already tasting like defeat. The ripple effect. The moment Daniel's car pulled away from the curb, Lila's legs gave out. She slid down against her apartment door, the cold wood pressing into her back as she clutched her phone, the patent approval still glowing on the screen. She should have been celebrating. Instead, All she could hear was Daniel's voice. Patents aren't cheap to defend. A knock at the door sent her scrambling to her feet. Had he come back? She yanked it open, ready to unleash every ounce of frustration. But it wasn't Daniel. Mira Patel stood in the hallway, her sleek black coat dusted with snowflakes, her dark eyes scanning Lila's face with an urgency that made Lila's pulse spike. You need to leave. Now. Lila blinked. What? Mira shoved a manila envelope into her hands. Daniel wasn't bluffing. The board already filed a challenge to your patent. They're claiming prior development. Lila's stomach dropped. That's impossible. They'll make it possible. Myra's voice was low, hurried. There's a flight to Seattle leaving in 2 hours. There's a tech incubator there. Green Horizon. They'll protect you. Ticket and contact are inside. Lila stared at the envelope, then back at Mira. Why are you helping me? Mira hesitated, then pulled a folded photo from her pocket. A young girl drinking from a rusted well. My sister. She died last year from contaminated water in Mumbai. Your design could have saved her. She pressed the photo into Lila's hand. Don't let them bury this. 1 year later, the stage lights at the Global Water Summit were blinding, but Lila didn't flinch. The crowd, scientists, journalists, even a few of the investors who'd once rejected her, leaned forward as she held up the sleek, palm-sized device. The Carter filter doesn't just clean water, she said, her voice steady. It changes lives. A screen behind her lit up with footage from Kenya, where children laughed under spray of a village pump fitted with her technology. Then Flint, Michigan, where a grandmother held up a glass of crystal-clear water for the first time in years. At the back of the room, Daniel Kingsley watched, his expression unreadable. When the applause died down, a reporter called out, "What's next for you?" Lila smiled, making sure no one ever has to beg for clean water or leftovers. Again, her eyes met Daniel's across the crowd. For a heartbeat, something passed between them. Not a challenge, not a victory, just understanding. Then she turned back to the lights. Did this story inspire you? Hit that like button. Subscribe for more real-life triumphs, and tell us in the comments, when has perseverance changed your life? Don't forget to share this with someone who needs a reminder that small beginnings can change the world.